She held the scissors high above my certification badge, her knuckles white with fury. "We are not dependent on a single badge to exist," Helen Sterling shouted, and with one decisive cut, she sliced through 13 years of my career. The laminated card fell in 2 pieces on my desk. Then I stood up, my heart pounding as the computer screen behind me flashed red. System alert. Primary custodian credentials revoked. All dependent certifications terminating. She had just notified the system that the custodian was removed. $80 million in government contracts were about to vanish. My name is Cherie, and I never imagined my life would unravel so dramatically in a corporate conference room on a Tuesday morning in Denver. But to understand how I got there, I need to take you back 13 years to when I first walked through the glass doors of TechGuard Solutions as a 25-year-old junior IT specialist with dreams bigger than my tiny studio apartment. Back then, TechGuard was a scrappy cybersecurity startup with just 15 employees working out of a converted warehouse. The founder, Robert Sterling, was the kind of boss who remembered your birthday and actually cared whether you understood the work. He saw potential in me that I barely recognized myself. While my colleagues were content with basic network maintenance, Robert encouraged me to pursue advanced cybersecurity certifications. "The federal government is going to need serious cyber protection in the coming years," he told me during my 6-month review. "Companies that can prove their expertise with proper certifications will dominate this market. But it takes someone special to navigate all the requirements." He was right. The certification process for federal cybersecurity work was incredibly complex. It required not just technical knowledge, but understanding of legal frameworks, compliance protocols, and security clearance procedures. Most people found it overwhelming. I found it fascinating. I started with the basic CompTIA Security Plus certification, spending evenings and weekends studying while working full-time. Then came the Certified Information Systems Security Professional credential, followed by the Certified Information Security Manager designation. Each certification built upon the last, creating layers of expertise that very few people possessed. But the real breakthrough came when I earned my Certified Cybersecurity Custodian designation from the Department of Defense. This wasn't just another certificate to hang on the wall. This made me legally authorized to maintain and validate cybersecurity frameworks for federal contractors. The government essentially trusted me to verify that our company met the strict security standards required for handling sensitive information. As I accumulated more certifications, something interesting happened. The federal compliance system began linking my credentials together, creating what they called a custodian chain. My master badge became the primary authentication for all related certifications. It was efficient and secure, but it also created something I didn't fully understand at the time: complete dependency. Over the years, TechGuard grew from that small warehouse operation into a major player in government cybersecurity. We landed contracts with the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and various intelligence agencies. Our annual revenue climbed to over $100 million, with 80% coming from federal contracts that required my certification validation. I became the Chief Cybersecurity Custodian, responsible for maintaining not just my own credentials, but overseeing the security framework for the entire company. Every employee's security clearance, every system access protocol, every compliance audit flowed through certifications that I maintained and validated. Robert always made sure I understood how important this role was. "You're not just keeping our certifications current," he would remind me. "You're the foundation that everything else is built on. Without your expertise and dedication, none of this would be possible." I took that responsibility seriously. I maintained detailed backup procedures, kept meticulous records, and ensured that every certification renewal happened months ahead of deadlines. I created redundant systems where possible and documented every process so thoroughly that our federal auditors regularly praised our organizational standards. The work was demanding but rewarding. I loved the intellectual challenge of staying current with evolving cybersecurity threats and regulations. I enjoyed the respect I earned from colleagues and clients who understood the complexity of what I managed. Most of all, I felt pride in knowing that our work protected critical national infrastructure and sensitive government operations. By my 13th year at TechGuard, I had earned every major cybersecurity certification available. My office wall displayed 23 different credentials, but the small badge I wore every day was the master key that validated them all. It contained embedded chips that connected to federal databases, automatically verifying my status and authorizing all dependent certifications. The system worked beautifully for over a decade. We never had a compliance failure, never lost a contract due to certification issues, and never faced questions about our security standards. I thought I had built something lasting and unshakable. Then Robert's daughter graduated from Harvard Business School with big ideas about modernizing the family company. Helen Sterling arrived at TechGuard with an MBA, a designer wardrobe, and absolute confidence that she understood business better than the people who had built the company. Robert, proud of his daughter's academic achievements and eager to bring her into the family business, appointed her chief operations officer, despite her complete lack of cybersecurity experience. From her first day, Helen questioned everything. She challenged established procedures, criticized existing systems, and suggested that TechGuard was stuck in outdated thinking. During her first company meeting, she announced her intention to streamline operations and eliminate inefficiencies. I should have recognized the warning signs immediately. Helen's first target became obvious within a week of her arrival. Me. Not personally at first, but the entire structure I had built around cybersecurity certification management. She scheduled a meeting with me on her third day, requesting what she called a comprehensive overview of dependencies and vulnerabilities in our current certification framework. I prepared thoroughly, creating detailed presentations that explained how federal cybersecurity certification worked, why the custodian system existed, and how our specific implementation protected both the company and our clients. I thought education would help her understand the complexity and importance of maintaining these systems properly. Instead, she focused on what she perceived as problems. So if something happened to you, the entire company's federal authorization could be at risk, she asked, leaning back in her chair with a concerned expression. That's why we have extensive documentation and backup procedures, I explained. Plus, transferring custodian responsibilities requires federal approval and takes several months to complete properly. It's not something that happens overnight. But theoretically, you could hold the entire company hostage by refusing to cooperate with any changes. The question caught me off guard. I would never do that. My job is to protect the company's interests and ensure compliance with federal requirements. Of course, she said. But something in her tone suggested she didn't quite believe me. I'm just trying to understand all the risks involved. Over the following weeks, Helen began bringing in outside consultants to evaluate our operational efficiency. These consultants had impressive credentials in business optimization but no background in federal cybersecurity requirements. They asked pointed questions about why a single person controlled such critical company assets and whether there were more modern approaches to certification management. I found myself constantly explaining basic concepts to people who were supposed to be experts. They suggested implementing commercial certification management software that would democratize the process and eliminate single points of failure. When I explained that federal cybersecurity certifications couldn't simply be managed through off-the-shelf business software, they looked at me like I was making excuses to protect my own job. The worst part was watching Helen nod along with their recommendations, as if 13 years of successful federal compliance meant nothing compared to generic business theories from consultants who had never worked with government security requirements. During one particularly frustrating meeting, a consultant suggested that our entire approach was unnecessarily complex and that modern best practices favored distributed certification management through cloud-based platforms. I tried explaining that federal law specifically required centralized custodian control for the type of high-security work we did, but Helen interrupted me. We can't let compliance requirements prevent us from embracing innovation, she declared. There has to be a way to modernize this system while maintaining our certifications. I began noticing other troubling changes around the office. Helen had convinced Robert to upgrade our internal systems, including security access protocols. She brought in new IT staff who didn't understand our federal compliance requirements and kept suggesting changes that would violate our security agreements. One morning, I discovered that someone had been attempting to access restricted certification databases using administrative credentials. The access logs showed multiple failed attempts to replicate my custodian permissions. When I reported this to Helen, she seemed more annoyed than concerned. Maybe someone was just trying to understand how the system works, she suggested. We need to document these processes better, so they're not so dependent on one person's knowledge. These aren't processes that can be documented for general access, I replied. Federal law requires specific individuals with verified credentials to maintain custodian control. The access attempts I found were actually violations of our security agreement. That seems excessive, Helen said. We should be able to cross-train people on all essential functions. I realized she fundamentally misunderstood what we were dealing with. This wasn't like cross-training someone to use the company database or manage vendor relationships. Federal cybersecurity custodian responsibilities were legally restricted to specifically certified individuals. You couldn't just train someone else to take over these functions. But Helen had already made up her mind that our current system was a problem that needed solving. The situation escalated when Helen scheduled a presentation to the board of directors about modernizing our operational framework. She didn't include me in the planning process, but I heard from other employees that she was preparing recommendations for major changes to how we managed federal certifications. I tried approaching Robert directly, but he was caught between supporting his daughter's business initiatives and maintaining the systems that had made the company successful. Helen has some interesting ideas, he told me. Maybe it's time to consider whether there are better ways to handle these certifications. Robert, the system we have works perfectly, I said. We've never had a compliance failure, never lost a contract due to certification issues. The federal auditors consistently praise our organization and documentation. Why would we change something that's working? Because Helen makes a good point about risk management, he replied. If something happened to you, we'd be in serious trouble. Maybe there's a way to distribute that risk while maintaining our standards. I could see that Helen had been working on him, probably emphasizing the potential vulnerabilities while downplaying the complexities involved in changing our approach. But I also knew that Robert trusted me and valued the success we'd built together. Give me a chance to present alternative solutions, I asked. If the board is concerned about single points of failure, let me show them the backup systems and transition procedures I've already developed. There are ways to address those concerns without throwing away 13 years of successful compliance. Robert agreed, and I spent the next 2 weeks preparing the most comprehensive presentation of my career. I documented every aspect of our certification management, explained federal requirements in detail, and outlined several options for creating additional redundancy while maintaining compliance. But the night before the board meeting, Helen cornered me in the parking garage with news that changed everything. I've spoken with the board about your presentation, she said, her voice carrying a cold confidence I hadn't heard before. We've decided to move forward with a different approach. Tomorrow's meeting will focus on implementing a new certification management platform that eliminates our current dependencies. You can't just eliminate federal compliance dependencies, I replied. They exist for legal reasons, not arbitrary ones. Well, see about that, Helen said, walking away with a smile that made my stomach drop. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find that Helen had scheduled her board presentation for the same time as mine, effectively canceling my opportunity to present alternative solutions. When I tried to object, Robert seemed embarrassed but unwilling to challenge his daughter's decision. Helen's prepared something that addresses all the concerns, he told me. Let's see what she has to say, and then we can discuss your input afterward. But as I sat in that boardroom listening to Helen present her recommendations, I realized there wouldn't be an afterword for my input. She had already convinced the board that change was necessary, and she had a specific solution in mind, replacing our entire custodian-based certification system with an automated third-party platform that promised to eliminate human error and organizational dependencies. The board, impressed by her professional presentation and convinced by consultant recommendations they didn't fully understand, voted to approve the implementation immediately. Helen's smile as the vote concluded told me everything I needed to know about her real intentions. I had just watched 13 years of my work get dismissed in a 30-minute presentation by someone who fundamentally misunderstood what she was trying to change. The morning after the board meeting, I arrived at work hoping there might still be time to explain the complications involved in implementing Helen's new system. Federal cybersecurity transitions required months of planning, extensive documentation, and approval from multiple government agencies. Even if the board wanted to move forward with changes, We needed to follow proper procedures to avoid losing our existing certifications. Instead, I found Helen waiting in my office with 2 security guards and a man I didn't recognize carrying a briefcase. "Good morning, Cherie," she said with artificial cheerfulness. "I'm here to begin the transition process we discussed yesterday." "What transition process?" I asked, setting down my coffee and looking at the guards with growing confusion. "The board approved investigating a new system, but implementing it will take months of federal approval processes." "That's where you're wrong," Helen replied, her tone shifting from friendly to businesslike. "I've been working with transition specialists who understand how to modernize these outdated systems quickly and efficiently." She gestured to the man with the briefcase, who stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to corporate presentations. "Miss Walsh, my name is David Chen from Secure Transition Solutions. We specialize in rapid certification platform migrations for companies moving from legacy custodian systems to modern distributed frameworks." I stared at him in disbelief. "You can't rapidly migrate federal cybersecurity certifications. The Department of Defense requires extensive verification procedures, security clearance transfers, and compliance audits. These processes exist for national security reasons." "That's old thinking," Helen interjected. "Modern platforms can handle all those requirements automatically through secure integration protocols." "No, they can't," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Federal cybersecurity certification isn't like migrating email systems or updating accounting software. The custodian designations I hold are legally binding appointments that require federal approval to transfer. You can't just install new software and expect it to replicate 13 years of verified credentials. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet displaying what looked like a professional presentation. "Actually, Miss Walsh, our platform has successfully managed similar transitions for dozens of federal contractors. The process involves creating parallel certification tracking while maintaining compliance with all existing requirements." "What federal contractors?" I asked. "Give me specific examples of companies that have transitioned custodian-level Department of Defense certifications using your platform." David hesitated for the first time. "Due to confidentiality agreements, I can't share client specifics, but our success rate speaks for itself." That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. He was either lying about his experience or talking about much simpler certification processes that had nothing to do with the high security clearances we maintained. "Helen, this is a mistake," I said, turning to address her directly. "Whatever this company has told you about their capabilities, they don't understand what we're dealing with here. Our certifications aren't just paperwork. They're linked to active federal security systems that monitor compliance in real time. If we disrupt the custodian chain incorrectly, we'll trigger security alerts throughout the Department of Defense." "That's exactly the kind of fear-mongering that prevents progress," Helen replied, her voice hardening. "You've convinced everyone that this system is too complex to change, but that's just because you want to maintain control." "This isn't about control," I said, frustration finally breaking through my professional composure. "This is about protecting $80 million in federal contracts that depend on maintaining proper certification protocols. If we lose these certifications, we lose everything." "We're not going to lose anything," Helen said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a pair of office scissors. "We're going to prove that this company is stronger than any single person's collection of badges." I watched in growing horror as she picked up my master certification badge from my desk. The small laminated card contained embedded security chips that linked to federal databases across multiple agencies. It wasn't just identification, it was the primary key that validated hundreds of dependent certifications throughout our company's systems. "Helen, put that down," I said, my voice tight with alarm. "You don't understand what that badge represents." "I understand perfectly," she replied, holding the scissors above the badge. "This piece of plastic has held our entire company hostage for 13 years. Everyone walks on eggshells around you because they think the business will collapse if anything happens to your precious certifications. That badge connects to federal security systems," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you damage it, the embedded chips will trigger breach protocols throughout the Department of Defense network. Every certification I maintain will be immediately flagged for review. Good, Helen said, raising the scissors higher. Maybe it's time for the government to see that we're not dependent on a single badge to exist. I realized she was actually going to do it. After years of successful federal compliance, after building one of the most respected cybersecurity operations in the industry, the CEO's daughter was about to destroy everything because she didn't understand how the system worked. Helen, please listen to me, I said, holding up my hands in a gesture of surrender. If you cut that badge, we'll lose access to federal systems immediately. Every active contract will be suspended pending investigation. The company's stock price will collapse. Hundreds of employees will lose their jobs. This isn't about me controlling anything. This is about protecting everyone who works here. But Helen was beyond listening. I could see in her eyes that she had convinced herself this was a necessary act of corporate liberation, a dramatic demonstration that TechGuard was ready to embrace the future without being held back by outdated dependencies. We are not dependent on a single badge to exist, she shouted. And with one decisive motion, she cut through the certification badge. The laminated card fell in 2 pieces on my desk, and I felt my heart stop as the embedded security chips scattered across the surface. Then I stood up, my legs shaking as I watched the computer screen behind me flash red with alerts. System alert. Primary custodian credentials. Revoked. All dependent certifications. Terminating. Federal compliance review initiated. Emergency protocols activated. Helen stared at the screen in shock as more alerts began cascading across every monitor in the office. The automated federal systems had detected the credential breach and were implementing emergency lockout procedures exactly as designed. What's happening? Helen asked, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. I looked at her with a mixture of pity and anger as the magnitude of what she had done became clear. You just notified every federal security system in the country that our company's primary custodian has been removed without authorization. Every certification I maintained for the past 13 years is now flagged as compromised. Every federal contract we have will be suspended within the hour pending investigation. The security guards looked confused, David Chen had gone pale, and Helen was staring at the broken badge pieces as if she couldn't believe what she had done. But the new system, she stammered. David said his platform could handle the transition. There is no transition, I said quietly. There's only the wreckage of what you just destroyed. The first phone call came exactly 17 minutes after Helen cut my badge. My desk line rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a federal priority contact. And when I answered, a crisp voice from the Department of Defense Cybersecurity Division asked to speak with the primary certification custodian for TechGuard Solutions. This is Cherie Walsh, I said, my voice hoarse from the shock of what had just transpired. Miss Walsh, our systems show an emergency credential breach alert for your custodian designation. Can you confirm the status of your primary authentication badge? I looked at Helen, who was still standing in my office staring at the broken pieces of my certification badge as if she couldn't quite believe what she had done. David Chen had quietly slipped out during the initial chaos, leaving behind only his business card and a lingering smell of expensive cologne. The badge has been physically compromised, I reported, following the protocols I had hoped never to use. The embedded security chips are damaged beyond recovery. Understood. Initiating immediate lockdown procedures for all dependent certifications. You have 48 hours to report to our Denver facility for emergency recredentialing review. Be advised that all federal contracts associated with your custodian designation are suspended pending investigation. The line went dead, and I realized that Helen was looking at me with dawning horror as she began to understand the implications of what she had done. Suspended, she whispered. What does that mean exactly? Before I could answer, my computer screen filled with automated notifications from federal compliance systems across multiple agencies. Each message carried the same basic information. TechGuard Solutions had experienced a critical security breach. All active authorizations were temporarily revoked, and immediate containment procedures were being implemented. It means, I said slowly, that as of this moment, we have no legal authority to access any federal systems, work on any government contracts, or handle any classified information. 80% of our business just disappeared. Helen sank into the chair across from my desk, her face pale as the reality of the situation began to register. But we can fix this, right? You can get new certifications, and everything will go back to normal. Helen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the churning anxiety in my stomach. Federal cybersecurity certifications aren't like renewing your driver's license. The custodian designation I held took 3 years to earn initially and required annual reviews to maintain. When a custodian badge is compromised this way, it triggers a full security investigation to determine whether the breach was accidental, negligent, or potentially malicious. Malicious. Helen's voice cracked on the word. But you'll explain that it was an accident, right? That I didn't understand what the badge was for. Before I could respond, my office phone began ringing continuously as news of our certification suspensions spread through federal systems. Each call brought worse news. The Department of Homeland Security was suspending our infrastructure monitoring contract. The Department of Defense was freezing payments on our active projects, and the intelligence agency contracts that represented our most profitable work were being transferred to backup contractors immediately. By 10:30 that morning, our chief financial officer, Janet Morrison, appeared in my doorway with a spreadsheet and an expression of barely controlled panic. "Cherie, I need to understand exactly what's happening," she said, stepping around Helen without acknowledging her presence. "Our accounts receivable department is getting calls from every major client asking about contract suspensions. The accounting system shows that we're going to lose nearly $7 million in monthly revenue if these suspensions continue past this week. They're going to continue much longer than a week," I said quietly. "Emergency recredentialing for a compromised custodian typically takes 6 to 18 months, depending on the scope of the investigation." Janet stared at me in silence for several seconds before turning to look at Helen with an expression of pure fury. "What exactly did you do?" She cut my certification badge in half. I explained before Helen could respond. She thought it would prove that the company wasn't dependent on traditional certification systems. "You did what?" Janet's voice rose to nearly a shout. "Do you have any idea what that badge represents? Do you understand that our entire federal business model depends on maintaining those certifications?" Helen seemed to shrink into her chair as Janet continued her tirade, but the damage was already done. Over the next 2 hours, I watched 13 years of careful relationship building collapse as federal agencies implemented their emergency protocols. The most devastating call came from Colonel Sandra Hayes, our primary contact at the Department of Defense. Colonel Hayes had worked with us for over 8 years and had always praised our compliance standards and security procedures. "Cherie, I have to be honest with you," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and professional duty. "This kind of custodian breach is unprecedented in my experience. Physical destruction of a master certification badge suggests either gross negligence or intentional security violations. Either way, it's going to be very difficult to restore confidence in your organization's ability to handle sensitive materials." "Colonel, I understand the gravity of the situation," I replied, "but I want to assure you that this was not a malicious act. It resulted from a misunderstanding of certification requirements by new management." "That may be true," Colonel Hayes said, "but from a security perspective, allowing unauthorized personnel to access and destroy critical authentication materials represents a fundamental breakdown in your internal controls. The investigation will need to examine whether your entire security framework is compromised." After that call ended, I realized that the damage extended far beyond the immediate certification suspension. We had lost the trust and confidence of federal agencies that had worked with us for years. Even if we could eventually restore our certifications, rebuilding those relationships would take additional years. Meanwhile, the company's stock price had begun plummeting as news of the federal contract suspensions spread through financial markets. Robert Sterling, who had been in meetings all morning trying to understand what had happened, finally appeared in my office looking like he had aged 10 years in a single day. "Cherie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "please tell me there's a way to fix this quickly." I looked at him with genuine sympathy as I explained the full scope of what we were facing. "Robert, the federal government doesn't just restore cybersecurity certifications after a breach like this. They need to investigate whether our security protocols were adequate, whether proper oversight was in place, and whether the breach indicates broader organizational problems. This process could take a year or more. A year. Robert stared at me in shock. We can't survive a year without federal contracts. I know, I said quietly. Helen, who had been silent during most of these conversations, finally found her voice. But David Chen said his platform could replace all the traditional certifications. Maybe we can still implement his system and restore our federal authorizations. Robert turned to look at his daughter with an expression I had never seen before, complete disappointment mixed with barely contained anger. Helen, there is no platform that can replace 13 years of verified federal certifications. The consultant you brought in either lied to you or didn't understand what we were dealing with. Either way, your decision to trust him over Cherie's expertise has destroyed this company. But I was trying to help, Helen said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. The business consultants all said that depending on a single person was too risky. The risk, Robert said coldly, was in changing a system that worked perfectly without understanding what we were changing. And now we're going to find out exactly how risky it is to run a cybersecurity company without any cybersecurity certifications. As the day progressed, the full magnitude of the catastrophe became clear. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, we had lost contracts worth over $60 million in annual revenue. The company's stock had dropped 43%, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value. Federal investigators had scheduled preliminary interviews with key personnel, and our legal department was warning that we might face criminal charges if the investigation revealed negligence in our security procedures. Most heartbreaking of all, I had to watch as employees who had trusted the company's stability began updating their resumes and reaching out to competitors who were suddenly very interested in hiring our newly available talent. Helen Sterling had accomplished in one morning what our competitors had failed to achieve in 13 years. She had completely destroyed TechGuard's position in the federal cybersecurity market. 3 days after Helen's catastrophic decision, federal investigators arrived at TechGuard with boxes of documents and a mandate to understand exactly how a certified custodian's primary authentication badge had been physically destroyed by unauthorized personnel. Lead investigator Sarah Martinez from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office set up a temporary command center in our largest conference room and began conducting interviews with everyone who had access to sensitive certification materials. I was among the first to be questioned, spending nearly 6 hours walking investigators through every aspect of our certification management procedures, security protocols, and the specific events leading up to the badge destruction. Agent Martinez was thorough and professional, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she began to understand the scope of what had happened. Miss Walsh, she said during one of our breaks, in 20 years of investigating cybersecurity breaches, I've never encountered a situation where a primary custodian badge was deliberately destroyed by company management. This case is going to require extensive analysis to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. Agent Martinez, I replied. I want to be completely clear about something. Helen Sterling made a terrible mistake, but I don't believe she intended to cause harm to national security. She genuinely thought she was modernizing our systems. Intent will be part of our investigation, Agent Martinez said. But the law doesn't distinguish between malicious destruction and negligent destruction when it comes to federal security credentials. Either way, critical authentication materials were compromised by unauthorized personnel. While the investigators worked, I began my own informal investigation into how Helen had gotten such dangerously wrong information about federal certification requirements. David Chen from Secure Transition Solutions had vanished immediately after the badge cutting incident, leaving behind only a business card with a disconnected phone number. When I searched for his company online, I found a professional website with impressive testimonials, but very few specific details about their actual services or client base. More disturbing, I discovered that Helen had been in contact with Chen for several weeks before the board presentation, receiving what she believed to be expert guidance on modernizing certification systems. She had apparently shared detailed information about our current procedures, including specifics about how my custodian badge authenticated our federal certifications. During Helen's interview with federal investigators, she broke down completely as she realized how thoroughly she had been manipulated. According to Janet Morrison, who was present during part of the questioning, Helen revealed that Chen had specifically encouraged her to take dramatic action to prove the company's independence from traditional certification systems. He told me that other companies had made similar transitions successfully, Helen told investigators. He said the key was showing federal agencies that we were committed to modernization, even if it meant temporarily disrupting old systems. But when investigators tried to verify Chen's claims about successful transitions, they found no evidence that his company had ever worked with federal contractors on cybersecurity certifications. In fact, they discovered something much more concerning. Secure Transition Solutions appeared to be a front company with connections to Meridian Cybersecurity, one of our primary competitors for federal contracts. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just corporate incompetence. It was deliberate sabotage disguised as business consulting. Helen hadn't just made a naive mistake. She had been the unwitting tool in a sophisticated corporate espionage operation designed to destroy TechGuard's federal business. I brought this information to Agent Martinez immediately, and she expanded the investigation to include potential corporate espionage and fraud charges against Chen and his associates. But even as the investigators worked to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy, the damage to TechGuard continued mounting. Our clients were not waiting for the investigation to conclude. Major corporations that had relied on our cybersecurity services began terminating contracts, citing concerns about our ability to maintain federal compliance. The financial markets continued punishing our stock price as analysts downgraded their recommendations based on our uncertain future. Most painfully, I watched as talented colleagues who had worked with me for years began accepting job offers from competitors. Our senior network architect, Marcus Thompson, gave his 2 weeks' notice after accepting a position with Meridian Cybersecurity. 3 of our best penetration testing specialists left for a startup that promised more stable career prospects. "I'm sorry, Cherie," Marcus told me during his exit interview. "I know this isn't your fault, but I can't afford to wait around hoping the company survives this investigation." Meridian offered me a 30% salary increase and immediate project assignments. I have to think about my family's security. I understood his decision completely, but it stung to realize that Meridian was systematically recruiting our departing talent while we dealt with the crisis they had helped create. They were not just stealing our contracts, they were absorbing our human capital and institutional knowledge. The situation grew even worse when Robert Sterling suffered what doctors described as a stress-induced cardiac event during a meeting with our board of directors. He was rushed to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, where cardiologists determined that while not technically a heart attack, the episode indicated dangerous levels of stress-related cardiovascular strain. With Robert hospitalized and Helen facing potential federal charges, TechGuard found itself without effective leadership precisely when decisive action was most needed. The board of directors, composed primarily of investors who understood financial markets better than cybersecurity operations, struggled to comprehend the technical and legal complexities of our situation. Janet Morrison stepped up to serve as interim CEO, but her background in finance didn't prepare her for managing a federal investigation or developing strategies for restoring cybersecurity certifications. She did her best to maintain operational stability, but without authorized access to federal systems, most of our technical teams had nothing to work on. During this leadership vacuum, I discovered additional evidence of the conspiracy against us. While reviewing access logs for our internal systems, I found that someone with administrator privileges had been copying files related to our federal certification procedures and client security protocols. The access pattern suggested systematic information gathering over several months, not random curiosity. When I brought this evidence to Agent Martinez, she assigned cybercrime specialists to analyze our network security logs. Their investigation revealed that sophisticated malware had been installed on our systems, designed to capture and transmit sensitive information about our certification processes and client security architectures. "This is definitely corporate espionage," Agent Martinez told me after reviewing the technical analysis. "Someone with significant resources and cybersecurity expertise orchestrated this operation. The malware was custom-built and professionally deployed. This wasn't amateur hour." The investigation also revealed that Helen's consultant, David Chen, was actually David Kellerman, a former federal contractor who had lost his own security clearances 3 years earlier due to ethics violations. He had been working for Meridian Cybersecurity under a false identity, specifically targeting companies like TechGuard for competitive intelligence gathering. They played a long game. I realized as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, they spent months positioning Helen to make exactly the decision that would destroy our federal certifications. They knew she was ambitious and inexperienced, and they fed her information designed to make her overconfident about changing systems she didn't understand. Agent Martinez nodded grimly. Corporate espionage cases often work this way. The perpetrators identify internal vulnerabilities and exploit them through manipulation rather than direct attack. In this case, they turned the CEO's daughter into an unwitting weapon against her own family's company. But understanding how we had been manipulated didn't solve our immediate crisis. TechGuard was still bleeding money, talent, and credibility, while Meridian Cybersecurity systematically absorbed our former market position. Unless we could find a way to restore our certifications and rebuild confidence in our capabilities, the company that Robert Sterling had spent decades building would not survive. And with Robert in the hospital recovering from stress-related health problems, and Helen facing federal charges for her role in the security breach, the burden of saving TechGuard was falling primarily on my shoulders. While federal investigators worked to uncover the full extent of Meridian Cybersecurity's corporate espionage operation, I realized that waiting for justice wouldn't save TechGuard. We needed immediate action to prevent complete collapse while positioning ourselves for eventual certification restoration. The challenge was finding ways to demonstrate our capabilities and rebuild client confidence without the federal authorizations that had been our primary competitive advantage. I started by reaching out to former colleagues who had moved to other companies, not to recruit them back, but to understand how other cybersecurity firms had survived certification challenges. Through these conversations, I learned about emergency restoration procedures that I hadn't known existed during my initial custodian training. Dr. Rebecca Santos, a former Department of Defense cybersecurity director who now worked in private consulting, agreed to meet with me at a coffee shop near the federal building, where I was spending most of my days working with investigators. Cherie, she said after I explained our situation. What happened to TechGuard is unprecedented, but it's not necessarily fatal. The federal government has procedures for restoring certifications when breaches result from external manipulation rather than internal negligence. I've been working with Agent Martinez on the investigation, I replied. But the process seems to assume that restoration will take at least a year. That's the standard timeline for negligence cases, Dr. Santos explained. But when federal investigators can prove that certification breaches resulted from criminal activity by external actors, there are accelerated restoration procedures designed to prevent unnecessary damage to innocent companies. She pulled out her tablet and showed me documentation for something called the Federal Contractor Protection Protocol, a little-known program that provided temporary certification restoration for companies that had been targeted by corporate espionage. The key is proving that your internal security procedures were adequate and that the breach occurred despite reasonable precautions, she continued. If investigators can demonstrate that TechGuard was the victim of a sophisticated attack rather than the source of negligent security practices, you might be able to restore basic certifications within 3 to 6 months. This was the first hopeful news I had heard since Helen cut my badge. Dr. Santos helped me understand what evidence would be necessary to qualify for the accelerated restoration program and connected me with attorneys who specialized in federal cybersecurity law. Armed with this new information, I began working with Agent Martinez to ensure that the investigation documentation clearly established TechGuard as a victim of corporate espionage rather than a negligent organization. We compiled evidence showing that our security procedures had been exemplary for 13 years, and that the breach occurred only because Helen had been systematically manipulated by external actors. Meanwhile, I developed an interim business strategy focused on services we could provide without federal certifications. Many of our commercial clients needed cybersecurity consulting that didn't require government clearances, and our technical team's expertise remained valuable even without formal federal authorizations. I presented this strategy to Janet Morrison and the board of directors, emphasizing that we needed to demonstrate continued operational capability while working towards certification restoration. We can't just wait for the investigation to conclude, I explained. We need to show clients and federal agencies that TechGuard is still a viable cybersecurity company. The plan involved pivoting temporarily toward commercial cybersecurity services, including network penetration testing, security auditing for private companies, and consulting on compliance frameworks that didn't require federal clearances. It wasn't as profitable as our government work, but it would keep our technical teams employed and maintain our reputation as cybersecurity experts. More importantly, I proposed creating a comprehensive documentation project that would demonstrate our commitment to security excellence. Working with remaining staff members, we would document every aspect of our cybersecurity procedures, create detailed training materials, and develop case studies showing how we had successfully protected sensitive information for over a decade. This documentation serves two purposes, I explained to the board. First, it shows potential clients that we have robust security procedures even during the certification restoration process. Second, it provides federal agencies with evidence that TechGuard takes security seriously and has learned from this experience. Janet approved the plan, and I began working 18-hour days to implement it while continuing to cooperate with federal investigators. The documentation project revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated before: the depth and sophistication of the security framework we had built over 13 years. Working with our technical teams to document procedures, I realized that our approach to cybersecurity had evolved far beyond simple compliance with federal requirements. We had developed innovative solutions to complex security challenges, created training programs that had educated hundreds of cybersecurity professionals, and built client relationships based on genuine expertise rather than just credential maintenance. This realization led to another strategic insight. Even if we couldn't immediately restore our federal certifications, we could position TechGuard as the cybersecurity company that had been targeted by competitors because of our excellence. Our experience as victims of sophisticated corporate espionage actually demonstrated our value to potential clients. I began reaching out to former clients, explaining the situation honestly, while emphasizing our continued technical capabilities. To my surprise, several major corporations expressed interest in working with us, specifically because they were impressed by how we were handling the crisis. Your response to this attack shows exactly why we want to work with you, the chief information officer of a major manufacturing company told me. If Meridian went to these lengths to sabotage your company, it means they were afraid of competing with you on merit. That tells us something important about your capabilities. The breakthrough came when Meridian Cybersecurity made a critical mistake. Believing that TechGuard was finished, they began aggressively marketing their services to our former clients, claiming that they were taking over our federal contracts and absorbing our best talent. They even issued press releases celebrating their successful recruitment of former TechGuard employees. But their premature victory celebration provided Agent Martinez with exactly the evidence she needed to prove the corporate espionage case. When a company claims credit for absorbing a competitor's business immediately after that competitor suffers a suspicious security breach, it suggests prior knowledge and planning. Federal investigators were able to trace financial connections between Meridian and the fake consulting company that had manipulated Helen. They found evidence that Meridian had specifically planned to absorb TechGuard's federal contracts and had been positioning itself to take over our clients months before the certification breach occurred. This gives us what we need for criminal charges, Agent Martinez informed me during one of our weekly meetings. More importantly for your company, it provides clear evidence that TechGuard was the victim of a premeditated attack rather than the source of negligent security practices. Within days of Meridian's premature celebration, federal prosecutors filed criminal charges against David Kellerman and 3 Meridian executives for corporate espionage, fraud, and violations of federal cybersecurity statutes. The indictments received significant media coverage, particularly because they involved sophisticated manipulation of an innocent company employee to achieve competitive advantages. The media attention actually helped TechGuard's reputation. Business publications covered the story as an example of how corporate espionage had evolved to target companies through internal manipulation rather than external hacking. Several articles portrayed TechGuard as an exemplary cybersecurity company that had been victimized by unethical competitors. More importantly, the criminal charges against Meridian triggered the federal contractor protection protocol that Dr. Santos had told me about. With clear evidence that our certification breach resulted from criminal activity by external actors, TechGuard qualified for accelerated restoration procedures. Robert Sterling, recovered from his cardiac episode and deeply shaken by how close he had come to losing everything, returned to active leadership with a new appreciation for the systems and relationships that had made the company successful. He publicly apologized to me and to all employees for allowing inexperience and family loyalty to override proven expertise. I learned something important about the difference between innovation and destruction, he told the company during an all-hands meeting. True innovation builds upon proven foundations. What Helen attempted wasn't innovation. It was reckless destruction of systems that worked perfectly. Helen Sterling, facing federal charges but cooperating fully with investigators, also acknowledged her mistakes in a statement that demonstrated genuine understanding of what she had done. I thought I was modernizing the company, but I was actually destroying 13 years of careful work by people who understood things I didn't take time to learn. I take full responsibility for my actions and their consequences. With criminal charges filed against the real perpetrators and evidence clearly establishing TechGuard as a victim rather than a negligent actor, we were finally positioned to rebuild what had been destroyed. But the work of restoration would require everything I had learned about cybersecurity, federal compliance, and business relationships over the past 13 years. 6 months after Helen cut my certification badge in half, I stood in the same Department of Defense facility where I had first earned my custodian designation 13 years earlier. This time, I was there for an emergency recredentialing ceremony attended by federal officials who had followed our case from the beginning. Colonel Sandra Hayes, who had worked with us for 8 years before the breach, delivered remarks that summarized the lessons learned from TechGuard's ordeal. This case demonstrates both the vulnerabilities and the strengths of our federal cybersecurity framework, she said. While criminal actors were able to exploit inexperience and family relationships to temporarily disrupt legitimate operations, our investigation and restoration procedures ultimately protected the innocent while holding the guilty accountable. The ceremony was more than just symbolic. Federal investigators had not only cleared TechGuard of any negligence but had actually recommended us for recognition as a model organization for cooperation during criminal investigations. Our comprehensive documentation of security procedures, complete transparency during the investigation process, and continued commitment to cybersecurity excellence had impressed everyone involved in the case. My new master certification badge contained enhanced security features designed to prevent the kind of physical destruction that Helen had accomplished 6 months earlier. More importantly, the federal government had approved a modified custodian system that included backup authorization procedures while maintaining the security standards that our work required. Miss Walsh, Agent Martinez told me after the ceremony, "Your professionalism during this investigation set a new standard for how cybersecurity companies should cooperate with federal authorities. Your documentation and analysis provided critical evidence that helped us understand the scope of Meridian's criminal operation." The criminal case against Meridian Cybersecurity had expanded far beyond our situation. Federal investigators discovered that they had targeted at least 6 other cybersecurity companies using similar manipulation techniques. David Kellerman and his Meridian associates were ultimately convicted on multiple federal charges, including corporate espionage, mail fraud, wire fraud, and violations of national security statutes. Kellerman received a 12-year federal prison sentence, while the 3 Meridian executives who had orchestrated the operation received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years. Meridian Cybersecurity lost all federal contracts and eventually declared bankruptcy after facing civil lawsuits from multiple victimized companies. But justice in the criminal courts was only part of TechGuard's restoration. The real work involved rebuilding client relationships, restoring employee confidence, and proving that our capabilities had not only survived the attack, but had actually been strengthened by the experience. Robert Sterling, deeply affected by how close he had come to losing the company he had spent decades building, approached leadership with new humility and wisdom. He restructured TechGuard's management to ensure that technical expertise would always have input on operational decisions and that dramatic changes would never again be implemented without thorough understanding of their implications. "I learned that respecting expertise isn't the same as being afraid of change," he explained during a company meeting. "True innovation requires understanding what you're changing and why. What Helen attempted wasn't innovation. It was destruction based on ignorance." Helen Sterling, who had pled guilty to federal charges as part of a cooperation agreement with prosecutors, received 3 years of federal probation and community service focused on cybersecurity education. More importantly, She had genuinely learned from the experience and became an advocate for proper cybersecurity training in business schools. I thought I understood business principles well enough to change technical systems I didn't comprehend, she said during her sentencing hearing. I was wrong, and my arrogance nearly destroyed a company built by people who understood things I didn't take time to learn. No MBA program prepared me for the complexity of federal cybersecurity compliance, but I was too proud to admit my ignorance. With our certifications restored and our reputation enhanced by how we had handled the crisis, TechGuard began winning new federal contracts at a record pace. Government agencies that had observed our professionalism during the investigation specifically sought us out for sensitive projects that required the highest levels of trust and expertise. Our commercial business also grew dramatically, as private companies realized that a cybersecurity firm targeted by sophisticated corporate espionage must possess valuable capabilities. Several Fortune 500 companies hired us specifically because they were impressed by our response to the attack and wanted to work with a company that had proven its resilience under extreme pressure. The employee exodus that had followed Helen's badge-cutting incident reversed as talented cybersecurity professionals sought to join a company with a reputation for excellence and integrity. We were able to recruit top talent from across the industry, including several former Meridian employees who had been disgusted by their company's criminal behavior. Most importantly, we used the lessons learned during our ordeal to develop new training programs and consulting services focused on protecting other companies from corporate espionage. Our experience as victims of sophisticated manipulation made us uniquely qualified to help other organizations recognize and defend against similar attacks. Robert promoted me to Chief Security Officer with full authority over all cybersecurity operations and a seat on the board of directors. But more meaningful than the title was his acknowledgement of what I had always known: that cybersecurity isn't just about technical systems and compliance procedures. It's about integrity, preparation, and the wisdom to build frameworks that can withstand attacks from both external threats and internal weaknesses. Cherie, Robert told me during my promotion announcement, you didn't just save the company's certifications. You saved the company's soul. Your commitment to doing things the right way, even when it was difficult and thankless, protected everyone who works here. The new TechGuard was stronger than the company that Helen had nearly destroyed. We had implemented more robust security procedures, developed deeper expertise, and built relationships based on trust earned through adversity. Our annual revenue grew to over $150 million as we took on increasingly complex and important cybersecurity challenges. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of our restoration was watching young cybersecurity professionals learn from our experience. We established scholarship programs for students studying cybersecurity compliance and developed internship programs that taught proper respect for the complexity and importance of federal security requirements. Standing in my new executive office 18 months after the badge-cutting incident, I reflected on everything we had learned from the experience. Helen's attack had nearly destroyed us, but it had also revealed the true strength of the systems and relationships we had built over 13 years of careful work. I learned that expertise isn't just about accumulating credentials. It's about understanding the deeper purposes those credentials serve and being willing to defend those purposes even when it's difficult. I learned that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt stronger than before if restoration efforts are based on genuine accountability and demonstrated competence. Most importantly, I learned that doing the right thing, especially during crises, creates foundations that support long-term success in ways that shortcuts and clever manipulations never can. Today, TechGuard Solutions employs over 400 cybersecurity professionals working on projects that protect critical infrastructure across the country. We maintain the industry's highest standards for federal compliance while continuing to innovate within proper frameworks. Our company culture emphasizes both technical excellence and ethical integrity, ensuring that we'll never again be vulnerable to the kind of manipulation that nearly destroyed us. Helen Sterling eventually rebuilt her career in cybersecurity education, using her experience to teach business students about the importance of understanding technical systems before attempting to change them. She became a powerful advocate for including cybersecurity compliance in business school curricula and for respecting technical expertise in corporate decision-making. The badge that Helen cut in half 6 months ago now sits in a frame in our company lobby alongside my current certification credentials. It serves as a reminder that even the strongest systems can be vulnerable to human mistakes, but also that resilience, integrity, and expertise can overcome even catastrophic setbacks. The inscription below the broken badge reads, "Excellence isn't about avoiding challenges. It's about responding to them with integrity and wisdom." That principle guides everything we do at TechGuard Solutions, and it's the foundation for the continued success we've built from the wreckage of that devastating Tuesday morning when everything fell apart. Have you ever had to rebuild something important after it was destroyed by someone who didn't understand what they were breaking? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if you found our journey inspiring. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about overcoming workplace challenges and building resilience in the face of adversity. Share this with anyone who has faced betrayal at work or had to fight to protect something they built with dedication and expertise. Thank you for listening to our story. And remember that sometimes our greatest setbacks become the foundation for our most meaningful comebacks.